Late last year, I toured Russia. I presented several seminars on dairy cattle management and met with government officials, agricultural ministers, and governors to share information about American-style dairy planning. I was joined on the trip by a Holstein Association veterinarian who promoted the sale of U.S. dairy cattle genetics. We covered a lot of ground. Russia is more than twice the size of the United States. It stretches across 11 time zones and accounts for 12% of the world's terrain. The Russians have only half our population. Their population is dropping by 0.5% a year, where the U.S. population is increasing by 1% and the world population is increasing by 1.5%. In our travels, we witnessed two contrasting cultures. There's the big city life of Moscow. Russia's capital city is nearly the size of New York City, snarled in traffic with yuppies driving fancy sports cars. On the other hand, there are the rural areas, especially in northern Russia, filled with poverty and old farm equipment, where it looked like the government was riding on the backs of its people. About 240 miles north of Moscow, the unproductive landscape of northern Russia, specifically the Kostroma region, is dotted by numerous farms that have been abandoned by operators who couldn't make it financially. Farm equipment sits in fields, right where it broke down after the communists lost power. I had heard Russian officials boasting about a special breed of dairy cattle that had been bred especially for Russia. When I went to check them out, I was surprised to find brown Swiss cows. But these weren't the brown Swiss cows we're familiar with in the United States. They were more like the brown Swiss back in the early days here, before they evolved from a dual breed raised for meat and milk to being today's highly productive milkers. The dairy herds in this region typically have a rolling herd average of 7,000 pounds, less than a third of the 22,000 pound average we're used to here. After our trip to Kostroma, we flew to the Krasnodar region in southern Russia, near the Black Sea. It's 1,000 miles south of Moscow. Krasnodar brought back memories of driving across Illinois near Galesburg. Flat, black soil, stretching as far as the eye can see, and the equipment in the fields looked very much like what you'd expect to see in a U.S. field, but in the 1960s. Dairy production in this region was better than up north, but still well below American standards. Some herds averaged as high as 12,000 pounds. Their crop yields were pretty comparable to our own, but they aren't using fertilizers to increase profits. That's certainly a practice that will catch up to them. For a time, the Russian government put a lot of money into building mega farms, but many of them failed. They didn't know how to manage them, and many new Russian dairies sit empty because they didn't budget for the cows. In other cases, the managers just didn't know what they were doing. So after the mega farm initiative, the Russian government began to build smaller dairies with 150 cow herds. They supposedly patterned this off what they saw as being successful in the United States. But of course, they were behind the curve. We know that smaller dairies without a special niche aren't efficient enough to make it in the current world economy. That it takes more like a 500 cow herd. While in Russia, I also learned a lot about the culture and the history and the people. I plan to learn a lot more as my work in Russia will continue. To prepare for this continuing work, I recently contracted with my translator and had an extraordinarily difficult time working out a method to pay him. American banks go out of their way to make it difficult and expensive to wire money to Russia. Banks readily accept money from Russia, but it's a whole different story when the money's going the other way. After applying with two banks to set up a system to routinely transfer money as needed, I was able to reach an agreement with a third financial institution using a payment system that was originally developed for American men purchasing Russian mail-order brides on the installment plan. I haven't told my wife Judy that I've learned how to order a bride, so mum's the word. It might come in handy someday if she decides she's had enough of her globe-trotting husband.
Down the Road is brought to you in part by Prince Agra, makers of Omnigen AF, advancing animal nutrition for healthy animals, and Woodruff Enterprise of Springfield, Ohio,